Welcome to Greek for a Week. I'm glad that you have decided to view another week of looking at Philippians. We are considering verses 8 and 9 of chapter 4. These are the final two verses of the paragraph 4, 1 through 9, which means I will be diagramming the entire paragraph next week. But before we do so, let's look at verse 8 here and verse 9, and we'll translate, and then we'll walk through a couple of things that might be helpful to understand just how Paul is putting these two verses together. He begins and he says, "Finally, brethren, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is pleasing, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, and if anything worthy of praise, think on these things. The things which you have learned and you have received, and you have heard, and you have seen in me. Practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you." So as you notice here, again, these are some these two verses here obviously are wrapping up what I would suggest is this paragraph. Also, for sure, I think these are part of Paul's final admonitions. We kind of see a note to this by the ta loipon, Varner, who has authored the Baylor Handbook on the book of Philippians in the handbook series. He states the adjective loipon. He says this adjective is functioning adverbially, and it serves as a climactic if you will, which introduces the final summation of Paul's emphasis on both thought and thinking. So basically he's saying here that this kind of climaxes to what Paul is trying to portray throughout his letter, the concept of how we think and how it is that we can remain together through our thought processes. The asa here, you see this, the hasa. Okay, there's a number of those you can see here in verse 8. That's nominative, neuter, plural. It's a relative pronoun. Relative pronoun, you can see the double accent mark there, followed by a predicate adjective, and that is throughout this particular verse. You'll see that we've mentioned that a number of times, and we've translated it as whatever. The a tis, okay, so here we have a moving forward there, you have a first class conditional clause. There's two of them, one also here. You could say that these clauses introduce the reality of the fact that the protasis is true. It's the if clause, if as we assume. In other words, if there is anything excellent, if there is anything worthy of praise. So we're going to assume that that's true. Then you have the apodosis, or the then clause here, the tauta lagitses the. Okay, here, then think on these things. So your lagitses the, that's a second person plural, present, middle imperative of lagizomai. Then in verse 9, we come down here, and Paul has multiple verbs throughout this particular verse. So if the things that you have heard, you've learned, you've received, all of these things, he's really asking the reader at this point that these things he wants them to practice. And as they practice these things, the God of peace again will be with them. So you have each of these aorist verbs here: mathete, pare, labete, kusate, and dete. All of these verbs here are aorist verbs. And Paul simply is saying that each of these that you have seen, if you will, in me, he's asking them. Then the imperative here, the prosete, is the imperative. He's asking them to practice. Practice everything that you have learned, you've received, you've heard, and you've seen in me. And then there's the idea that the God of peace here, okay, the God of peace will be with you. So that's the meta humon. That would be the preposition of accompaniment. So God will indeed be with you. So I think the two imperatives here, lagiseste here, as well as prosete, these will be the governing, the two main imperatives, if we will, the two main verbal forms that when we look at the paragraph as a whole next week, we will see just how those are going to be used as an admonition that Paul has for the reader, the original reader there of the church at Philippi. Trust this has been helpful. We've now wrapped up chapter 4, verses 1 through 9. We'll diagram next week.